Robby, tell us what's on your radar.
Big tech censorship. The topic is on the minds of a vast range of people, everyone from progressives like Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, to more moderate liberals like President Joe Biden, to conservative and Trumpist figures like Senators Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, and of course the former president himself. Now, many social media users have been wrongly silenced by platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube for dissenting from centrist, normie, mainstream media orthodoxies. Indeed, the platforms often do the bidding of the government itself, working to quash alternative views about the origins of COVID-19, for instance. Now, there's no doubt that social media moderators have made plenty of mistakes and caused real harms. But some of the politicians who whine about censorship, particularly their own, are cynically exploiting the issue to make themselves look like victims when they aren't. Take J.D. Vance. Vance is the author of Hillbilly Elegy, a 2016 memoir about growing up in Appalachia amidst alcoholism and abuse, dwindling economic prospects, and social rot. Escaping his family's poverty, Vance joined the Marine Corps, attended Yale Law School, and became an attorney at a corporate law firm. The release of his book coincided with Donald Trump's rise to political popularity, and Vance became well known for his insights into the Trump phenomenon. Hillbilly Elegy gave a voice to the struggling white working-class voters in the Rust Belt who were once loyal to the Democratic Party but now belonged to Trump's version of the GOP. While Vance was sympathetic to Trump voters, he was unrelentingly critical of Trump himself, saying the eventual president's policy proposals ranged from immoral to absurd, and that God wants better of us. But Trump won, becoming the sun at the center of the Republican universe. Everyone who wanted to claim a position of influence on the right had to either join his orbit or be consumed. And so Vance became a loyal satellite. He apologized for all the mean things he said about the president and is now one of Trump's most vociferous intellectual supporters. You see, Vance has political aspirations for himself and has decided to run for the U.S. Senate in Ohio. In the GOP primary, he is facing off against another very pro-Trump Republican, Josh Mandel. To win Trump voters, it's important to sound like Trump, to the extent that's possible, and talk about the issues that mattered to Trump's most animated supporters. Now, perhaps no issue fits the bill better than big tech censorship. Trump fretted constantly about a vast silencing of conservatives on social media, and yes, he was eventually ejected from it. Vance is similarly worked up about big tech and has called on the government to take aggressive action against major tech companies. His platform says big tech should be broken up, its political and economic power reduced. Now, this week, Vance claimed that he had also become a victim of big tech censorship after Twitter suspended the account associated with his campaign. "No warning," wrote Vance, "no explanation of what rules I allegedly broke. But this is what happens when we allow 5 companies to control what we are allowed to say." To be clear, Twitter did not suspend Vance's main account. Indeed, his chosen means of communicating his frustration about Twitter was still Twitter. But the inexplicable suspension of this smaller account nevertheless prompted him to accuse the company of election interference and censoring conservative voices. Conservative news outlets like Breitbart and The Federalist swiftly published articles about the silencing of Vance. Several hours later, the account was reinstated, but this did not diminish the outrage. Well, I was a little skeptical about the story, specifically about the idea that Twitter was actually punishing the campaign account for wrongthink. So I got in touch with Twitter. According to the company, the actual reason for the suspension is not very sinister at all. Moderators at Twitter thought the campaign account, which has many fewer followers than Vance's main account, was an impersonator. The company suspended the account in error and reversed course after a few hours. The account you referenced was suspended for violations of our impersonation policy in error, a Twitter spokesperson told me. That enforcement has been reversed and the account has been reinstated. The account's followers will take 24 to 48 hours to fully restore. So there was no conspiracy on the part of Twitter to throw the Republican primary election to Vance's competitor, Josh Mandel, which would have made no sense since Mandel's passion for breaking up big tech is no weaker than Vance's. There was no nefarious plot to silence Vance for his right-wing views. At a quick glance, the account looked illegitimate, and Twitter took erroneous action in order to protect the integrity of Vance's feed. Yet Vance is already using this small and inconsequential incident to further his case against Twitter and also all other social media platforms. Now that Twitter has provided a satisfactory explanation for the improper suspension, I think it'd be good for Vance to acknowledge it. He has not done so yet. Now, if it sounds like I'm picking on Vance, well, I am. But big tech censorship is a problem. But noisy controversies like this obscure the real issues. Political figures shouldn't desperately look for ways to turn mundane circumstances into vast conspiracies of which they are themselves the victim. At no point during this recent incident was Vance unable to speak to his supporters. Indeed, he wasn't even prevented from speaking to them on Twitter specifically. So this is actually an important paradox of the right-wing war on big tech, and one I covered extensively in my forthcoming book, Tech Panic: Why We Shouldn't Fear Facebook in the Future. Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms do take action against contrarian right-wing speech with some frequency, and that can be a big problem, limiting the conversation in unhelpful and frankly unfair ways. But on the whole, social media is actually a massive, powerful promoter of conservative speech. That's because social media doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is in fact a competitor to the traditional media, where conservatives are far less able to get their message out effectively. On any given day, at any moment in time, the most popular, widely read, and broadly shared articles on Facebook come from conservative news sites: Fox News, The Daily Wire, Breitbart, and others. Conservative figures like Tucker Carlson, Dan Bongino, and Ben Shapiro do extremely well on social media. Their perspectives reach a much larger audience because of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. The irony is that if people like J.D. Vance got their way and substantially diminished the influence of social media, then they would be left with the traditional media, which is much, much more hostile to them than Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey are. Facebook makes some mistakes and takes down provocative content it ought to leave up, but mainstream newspapers, magazines, and news channels would never have published such content in the first place. So it's in fact not surprising when you think about it that the group of people who are most in favor of regulating social media are journalists who work at places like the New York Times and CNN. They correctly see social media as a competitor that has broken their ability to perform a gatekeeping function and prevent non-mainstream views from entering the public square. During interviews with tech insiders that I conducted for my book, it became crystal clear that many of the worst social media moderation decisions were not arrived at by the companies themselves. Mainstream journalists motivated them to make these bad calls and threatened to expose them to bad press unless they obeyed. Now, importantly, leftist voices have also faced censorship at the hands of big tech. But on the whole, they still get a much fairer shake online than they do in the pages of the Washington Post. Be wary of calls to do something about big tech that would necessitate making social media an even less friendly place for dissident voices. Some people can't live with Twitter, but we really can't live without it. So, Kim, I know you've had your own struggles with social media censorship on YouTube particularly. My point is just that we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater on this thing, because obviously it is so much better for people who are speaking truth to power in ways that the mainstream, the corporate press doesn't like. Thank God we have things like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook to get our message out.
Yeah, I would say, though, that it's not necessarily a left-right issue on who's being censored. It's more of an anti-establishment disruptive issue. So if you're too disruptive, too anti-establishment, and you don't go along with one of the narratives, be it the mainstream Republican or the mainstream Democrat narrative, then you have a high chance of being censored. I do want to say, though, that I don't really believe Twitter and what their excuse was to you about why they took down J.D. Vance's account. And have you ever actually attempted to take down an account based on impersonation? I've had to do it a couple of times. And you have to jump through quite a few hoops to prove that you are you and that that account is not you. You have to show your identification. You have to show links to your websites. Like, you have to actually give them evidence that this other account is, in fact, impersonating you and is not you, and that you are you. So I have a hard time believing them in their excuse that they say, well, we did it because it was an impersonation account, we think. They usually have much higher standards than that in removing those types of accounts.
Well, I'll tell you why I disagree with that. Actually, so I've had this happen to me on Instagram, and I've reported impersonator accounts, and they've taken them down immediately without any additional need for me to supply anything. Also,
right,
I think
that's Facebook. But Twitter,
and also they know you're writing a book about Facebook.
Yeah.
But I think but what's the Twitter makes moderation decisions that I think are wrong and that they get widely denounced for and criticized for all the time. So it doesn't make sense to me that because they backpedaled immediately and restored his account, like they would just own it and do it anyway. They do that all the time. So the fact here that they said, oh, we screwed up, that's not actually something they usually do unless they really actually do think they screwed up. They don't tend to make face-saving moves.
Well, I just think that a lot of their moderators are individuals. It's not necessarily the company itself or company reps. It's like some person that they've hired that's going around and making these decisions. And then if the upper management says, oh, whoops, not really the best decision, then they reverse it.
Yeah.
So that I just think it's like some young Silicon Valley, person.
I mean, this account only had a handful of tweets. It hadn't really tweeted anything that would. I honestly think I think they thought it was an impersonating account, and JD Vance is using this as a moment to be like, look at my censorship. Well, what do you think, Ryan?
I mean, I think that if it is what they say it is, that's kind of funny because, like Kim said, Twitter really can't be bothered to do any work to curate or help out people when they're saying like, look, somebody's impersonating me, or look, this person is being impersonated and ought to be verified. Like you have to harass them endlessly to get them to actually do something about that. And so if they went out of their own volition and tried to clean up JD Vance's feed, that'd be kind of amusing. I think at the heart of this is a contradiction that big tech critics haven't, and I include myself in this, haven't quite resolved yet, and that's that if you do break up if you do break up big tech, then and you create a whole bunch of social media competitors, then each one of those competitors is then incentivized to ramp up their algorithm to like a hostility level of 111, getting everybody at each other's throats so that they can all increase their own engagement, and then you've poisoned kind of the atmosphere of the public debate that much more. At the same time, if you allow these monopolies to continue to kind of share all their data, having Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp all combined into one thing and keeping competitors out, then you also create all sorts of problems. If you turn them into a public utility, we've already seen all you have to do is put some partisan hack on top of the U.S. Postal Service, and even the U.S. Postal Service isn't immune to partisan influence. So do you want either Democrats or Republicans running a public utility and tweaking the algorithm there? So I think I don't think any of these are easy questions.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to your radars coming up next. Stay with us.